Good morning, everyone. Yeah, that's working. Brilliant. Is that working online? Colleagues, excellent, brilliant. Well, good morning, everyone. I am Laura Merritt, Director of ODI Europe, which is a global affairs think tank here in Brussels, bringing a global perspective into the European debate and part of the ODI Global Network. Thank you all for joining us so early this morning, which I think is really a sign of the importance and timeliness of this debate and discussion that we're going to have today. We are here to launch our new report, The Case for Development in 2025, exploring new narratives for aid in the context of the EU's strategic agenda. Now, development aid, i.e. financial technical support from wealthier nations to less wealthy countries and contexts, has long supported economic and social development. That need remains clear, and in many ways it is even more essential today. For example, Kenya has made impressive economic gains, but still requires collaboration to manage debt restructuring and strengthen financial systems. Or, as I'm sure you've all seen in the last week, the horrific events in Sudan, we know that beyond the acute humanitarian need, there are long-term needs, such as rebuilding an education system with millions of children out of school. These examples show that development needs are real, specific, and urgent, and that aid is about investing in systems, infrastructure, and people in ways that make economies stronger and societies more resilient. At the same time, though, as I'm sure we're all very aware in this room, the development sector is undergoing a major transformation. The global landscape has shifted and international relations are evolving. New financial actors have emerged and partner countries are clear in identifying the types of cooperation they want. The old narratives that we have no longer fit the world that we are now in. So the question is not whether development aid still has a role. The real question is how we articulate the need and the mechanisms to deliver aid more effectively, and what narratives can communicate why that matters today. And how do we design cooperation that supports long-term priorities while navigating fiscal constraints, geopolitics, and public expectations? How can Europe, especially with its new strategic agenda, if I say new, is it that new now? Probably not, champion a refreshed vision rooted in partnership, effectiveness, and long-term thinking. And that is exactly what we are trying to do with the report that we are going to talk you through today. So we are going to move through the presentation and the panel, and I'm going to encourage you to have your questions ready, because we really want this to be an open and engaging conversation. So to take us through the findings, I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague, Claire Kumar, who is Head of Policy at ODI Europe. And after Claire's presentation, we're going to move on to our high-level panel with distinguished speakers to reflect on what these insights mean in practice for the EU, its partners, and the future of international cooperation. So a huge thank you once again to all of you for being here, and Claire, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dora. Okay, so very happy to be here today. I should say this is me on behalf of my three co-authors. So that's Nerea Craviotto here in the room, Karen Hargreaves back in the UK, and Jessica Produceri, also an ODI Global Researcher. And just to present the research aims, we were looking at three key things. So first, how narratives around aid have shifted in Europe. Second, we wanted to look, as Dora mentioned, at the EU strategic agenda, and specifically see what narratives are emerging there, what implications that has for international cooperation. And our third aim was really the hardest, which narratives might have most traction with policymakers in this new context. And I should just caveat quickly that we really were thinking of traction with policymakers, not with the public, so we weren't especially focused on public opinion. Of course, they're interlinked, but that was not our primary goal. I should also say we did a very large stakeholder consultation. We talked to a lot of bilateral donors, EU institutions, civil society. And actually, we're more arguing than comments. So we really had some really excellent discussions, and thank you to everybody here. You know who you are, the ones who contributed to this. Just in terms of our first key finding, not a surprising one, we find a very large consensus that the traditional moral arguments for aid no longer have traction with policymakers. Now, again, I should caveat here, it's quite different with the public. The public don't feel the same way about national interest arguments, that they would prefer to hear that aid is tackling hunger and disease than that it's following a military objective or supporting a domestic firm. I think the second caveat was the moral argument still has quite a lot of traction for humanitarian aid. But certainly for the rest, I think we're certainly in this more transactional moment. However, a lot of our interviewees also really encouraged us to reflect on the fact that aid has always been self-interested and empathy in a much more, maybe not so visible way. So the people were telling us actually it's more explicit now, but it hasn't really changed that much. And I think some also felt, particularly our centre-right interviewee, that actually transactional arguments are useful because in this very difficult fiscal context, they help us shore up support for aid. And then there was a whole other group who actually welcomed transactional narratives because they said it's more honest. At least now we know what's on the table, which is interesting. And just a quick aside on what's driving this, I think it's tempting for a lot of people to think that the public is driving this. And we have seen public support decline over the years for aid, but actually if you look at the tracking data, you'll see support is still pretty strong from the public. Often more than half the population do not support cuts to aid budgets. And if you look at humanitarian aid spending, public support is exceptionally high. So aid is actually still broadly popular. And I think what we do need to recognise, however, is it's a low salience issue and a low information topic. And that has some consequences when it comes to the popularity of narratives. So just in terms of some of the conclusions, certainly our stakeholders felt, well, they conveyed a sense, let's say, of very pragmatic acceptance about this direction of travel towards a more self-interested approach. There was very little pushback coming from the people we interviewed. But there was also a very interesting, strong feeling that we need to look beyond aid systems and this sort of order mindset and get aid out of its political silo. And I think that was a very important message. Many already are really embracing this concept of mutual benefit partnerships. And I know this is a big thing for people in this room. They want to unpack that concept more. But there were clearly a lot of fear. And so people were mentioning, especially particular geographies that might get neglected, including fragile states, as well as topics, of course, like governance, rule of law, gender equality, democracy, rights, those sorts of agendas that can be neglected. And just to move on maybe to the strategic agenda aspect. So we were looking at migration, defence, security, competitiveness, and looking at those policies and narratives and really trying to unpack those in terms of implications for international cooperation. It's a very long report, it's quite complex, there's I can only cover a little bit today, but to focus on the most negative aspect first, we find that aid and how it's been interlinked with migration has been highly problematic. There was a super strong consensus from our stakeholders that the narratives that aid can stem migration really lack credibility, they're not based on evidence. Also, we find evidence, of course, showing that it's actually served to politicize aid. And when you add in the sort of harmful practices that are associated with this area in terms of border control, and then layer on top the lack of mutual interest in the migration-focused partnerships, you just end up in a really difficult area. So here, there's another additional aspect, which is the conflict between the priorities. So, of course, the narratives and policies on migration, we feel really conflict with the EU's stance on competitiveness. And this is the bit that no one really talks about very much. Even in the excellent Draghi report, you'll see the analysis on the role and relevance of immigration for different sectors, growth and competitiveness is really missing. It's not done well. And I think that's the gap that really needs to be addressed. So all in all, on migration, we thought it was quite problematic. We don't recommend narratives that focus on aid and migration. It's a very divisive and polarizing area. Now, there were some other negatives, of course, including that defence spending may put aid spending in peril. We have some nice data in the report on that if people are interested. But there's also some positives. And I think just to highlight a few, quite a few people saw this as an opportunity to expand the definition of defence spending. And I think there is a real feeling that that could gain traction. We would really like the development community to be part of those debates and actively feeding into those discussions. I think it's also very clear that there is an opportunity to advance more comprehensive security focused narratives. So rather than this narrow military security focus, we have an opportunity here to focus on real human food areas. And we know this is in line with how the public understands security because there's good data on that. So the public understands food supply chains, health systems, flood responses are really critical. So I think we could do a lot more as a community to build that comprehensive security narrative. And actually, it's our security community stakeholders that we were talking to who were saying this to us very strongly. Now, in terms of the big question, which narratives would gain traction? So we were looking for what's unifying, what reduces polarization, where there's political kind of consensus. And I'm sure many people are aware there's a back to basics narrative emerging already quite strongly. Many see this as the pragmatic way forward. But of course, that means maybe a focus on poverty reduction aims and priority geographies more strongly, which some might welcome. But we know in reality, it means difficult choices. But I think the key to point out is that there's certainly consensus across the broad political spectrum that would increase the credibility of aid and the case for aid. It would also make aid more understandable to the public. The public already associate aid with its basic functions. So there are some, strengths there. But I think in terms of building significant large-scale support for international cooperation, we found that addressing shared global challenges was the strongest framing. I don't think that's going to be a surprise to a lot of people in this room. But here we're talking about things like climate, public health, water, food systems, sorry, that's the key area to make this tangible. And this is, we know this is comfortable terrain for the EU because historically it's been a leading actor in global public goods, but we still detected concern that, of course, aspects like climate were really falling down the EU member states' agendas. Still, having said that, we felt it was the key area to maintain developmental investments and move beyond north-south binaries, etc. And I think just a few things to say, we do think there's very plausible narratives here because there is so much external evidence on these challenges. The facts really matter for the plausibility of your narrative, even though you might feel that they don't, they do. We were given a lot of advice and caveats, things like make it tangible to your domestic audience and your domestic policy with your audience, make sure you're blending the national self-interest with external aspects. A lot of caveats on message testing, particularly because this global agenda, global concerns can be co-opted and really sort of framed as part of these, there's a lot of resistance to these kind of globalist agendas. So there are elements of risk here. But just an aside, we know that academic theory tells us you need a conducive context for narrative to be traction. And aid really struggles because it's a low salience issue. But there isn't a really conducive context for shared global knowledge. And the reasons are it's a high salience issue. These are high risk issues. The public really are genuinely concerned, which means there's a tangible need for a narrative. So making this association is quite productive for aid. A key problem that we find is if you take climate, for example, private citizens tend to massively underestimate how others feel about climate action. So there's a big perceptions gap here. And it's not just the public underestimating how others feel, it's politicians underestimating how the public feels. So the perceptions gap is really significant. We feel it would be very helpful if that perceptions gap could be closed, really difficult to enable narratives and the challenges to prosper a bit. My final point is just around speaking to economic security and competitiveness, which our stakeholders really welcomed, very ripe area, very intuitive. We know these agendas are very aligned. We know there's lots of interesting opportunities for mutual benefit partnerships from critical raw materials, renewable energy, pharmaceuticals. There are risks. People do fear that we will fall into the traps of the past, that there will be genuine partnerships, there'll be extractive elements. But at the same time, we did find real, genuine optimism here. And I think, interestingly, people were pointing out to us that they were so surprised there's so little good communication on the big, large-scale aid successes. So if you look at M-Pesa, the mobile money transfer service in East Africa, that should be a household name associated with aid investment. It's not. People were pointing to biotech and EU investments in vaccine production and saying, look at how compelling that area is for new narratives. You've got public health, manufacturing capability, scientific expertise. Those are the areas that we need to demonstrably be linking aid budgets to those successes. I think there was just a final sort of clear finding around the messenger. We know the plausibility of a narrative is directly connected to the messenger. And so in this particular area, that means the private sector voice helps make this credible. But I did want to make very clearly, the advice we got was not that the development community should abandon moral arguments. Many felt that that would be not credible in itself. So you shouldn't necessarily try to ditch your moral argument and embrace the commercial argument. It's the issue of blending those narratives effectively and using different voices to do that. And just one final comment, just to connect back to that general finding, we need to think outside the aid system. Other EU policies and funds are relevant. We were wondering, for example, about the European Competitiveness Fund that will come. Will that have an external dimension? Should it have an external dimension? I think these are the questions we need to be looking at and trying to bring our development logic into those areas. And I'm going to leave it there, Ida, and hand it back to you. Yes. I forgot one thing, Ida, and I will get shouted at if I don't say it. We will send the report round to everybody. It's very long, but there's an executive summary and infographic. So you'll get an email after this with the link to everything.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you for welcoming us here this morning. I think you set the scene really well, Claire. I commend the report, and it's not too long because it's really packed with very, very interesting analysis and interviews. And so please don't be shy about digging in and reading it. So good morning to you all. I hope you have lots of energy to engage in this morning's critically important discussion. My name is Ida McDonnell. I head up the Development Research Unit in the OECD, and within the OECD, the Development Cooperation Directorate, which also serves as a secretariat to the Development Assistance Committee, which I suspect many of you are familiar with. Which is responsible, among other things, for standards around official development assistance. And I can tell you this morning that narratives is top and center of our discussions also in the Development Assistance Committee. But the questions we're discussing this morning have been simmering for a number of years. They're not new per se, but what we can say is that the simmer has come to a boil, and we may indeed be boiling over in 2025. There is the drastic cuts in official development assistance, I think, are indicative of a much deeper shift, even a crisis in support for official development assistance, a sense of relevance, and a confidence in a shared raison d'etre somehow in international development cooperation and within that ODA. We did projections earlier this year, and the ODA cuts for 2025 alone are going to be between 9 and 17%. And we're looking at a 26% cut in ODA in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's driven by unprecedented cuts in the same year by 4 major providers of official development assistance, who are likely also to cut again in 2026. So we are facing a very challenging reality. And Development Assistance Committee members are actually also facing that reality and announced at the FFD conference in Sevilla a major review of their role and functioning. And the plan there is also to come up with a forward-looking narrative for international development cooperation and to do that in an inclusive way. And at this moment, I take the moment just to invite you all also to engage in that. So when we talk about the case for development, I think that this report closes a major gap, because it gets beyond the general thinking about narratives and this recourse to the idea that a new narrative will fix everything, because it doesn't. It's what we do and how we do it that actually changes things and makes international cooperation credible. So it's not also just about aid. So I really welcome this report. I think that it can be a useful guide to rebuild international development cooperation going forward, and in that to tell the new story and to show the new story about the purpose and impact of international development cooperation for people and for their lives, and within that, of course, living on a safe planet. So this morning now, I'm going to turn to our discussion, because I think together we can, and with you in the room, make a step forward and perhaps find a common ground for making the case for development. So it's my pleasure now to introduce you to this great lineup of speakers, our panelists, and get the discussion started. We have 2 rounds of discussions. And we are going to keep some time for engaging with you all and hearing your questions. But if you can get a moment, I think we have a great lineup. If you just let me introduce our panelists, and then we'll return to the questions. So we have Martin Seychelles, who is Deputy Director General of INTPA, has been serving as Deputy DG since 2020. Previously, you were Deputy Director General for Health and the Health and Food Safety Director General, responsible for public health and health systems, covering a number of policy areas such as health securities, health systems, and pharmaceuticals. That's already bringing us close to many of the issues that we're looking at as we look at narratives. We have Ambassador Angus Campbell, who is Ambassador of Australia to Belgium and the European Union. Welcome. And you have, you were Chief of the Australian Defence Force, and prior to that you served as Chief of Army. Previously you held positions of Head of the Office of National Security and then Deputy National Security Advisor in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. You've served operationally in the United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor and as Commander of Australian Forces in the Middle East area of operations. Welcome. Happy to see you. We have Jean van Vetter, who is CEO of Enable, the Belgian Agency for International Cooperation. Prior to this role, he held positions such as DG at Handicap International, or Humanity and Inclusion, as we call it now, and Tanzania Country Director at VSO. Currently, he co-chairs the Practitioners Network for European Development Cooperation, a platform of European organisations, which supports knowledge exchange, joint action, strategic dialogue among members of the EU institutions. Then we have Olumide Mbimbola, Executive Director of Africa Policy Research Institute, founder also of APRI. His areas of focus include economic informality, trade policy, regional integration, and natural resources management. Before APRI, you worked at the Connex Support Unit, a GIZ-hosted G7 initiative funded by the German government and the European Commission. He's also previously worked on trade and regional integration at the African Development Bank. And lastly, but not least, and the women are closing each end of the panel, as you can see, we have Gail, who is a senior consultant, Gail Hurley, I should give your surname too, is a senior consultant on development finance with over 20 years experience in research policy advice, analysis, and project implementation. Currently, she's a member of the working group of the Global Public Investment Network. She's conducted new research looking at what the EU structural and cohesion funds can teach us about international cooperation, lessons she will share with us today. So there you go. I think we have quite an esteemed panel, and let's, I think, dig in. So what we'll do now is have a first round of questions, about 5 minutes each, if you like. And I'm going to turn to you, Martin, if that's for you. So you are in the team that leads the EU's international, the international partnerships, of course. But in your view, how is a more transactional approach to cooperation shaping the priorities and objectives of DG Impact? What's changing, if I may? And then maybe just if you could give us some concrete examples of what this means in practice to align cooperation, development cooperation, defence, security, competitivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question and good morning. I'll dive straight into the issue and pick on the word transaction, try to unpack that word because it causes a lot of reactions these days. If we think about it for a moment, every relationship between countries, between regions, must be transactional to be able to be long-standing and to succeed. Transactional in the sense that it must be based on mutual benefit, shared objectives, shared goals. This is the only way to make such a relationship sustainable in the long term, but also it creates the political space, the political capital that is needed to discuss problematic issues that always arise between states and between regions. So we should think about transactional in that sense. How do we construct a mutually beneficial relationship? Now, if we look carefully at what our partners around the world are looking for, I mean, we live in a very different world from what it was, say, 10, 20 years ago. Countries look at all possible partners. They are not so much looking, with some exceptions, of course, not so much looking for aid for the sake of aid, but they are looking for aid to transform their economies, add value in their economies. They are looking for investment. They are looking for knowledge transfer, technology transfer. They are looking for strategic autonomy, a word we hear very often these days. Now, how to basically secure their vital interests. And if we think about it even more, that's also what we are doing. We also need to ensure our strategic autonomy in areas like energy, in areas like critical raw materials, issues around the provision of health commodities. We are also looking to secure alliances and goodwill throughout the world, which we also need. So around this construct, we can create a mutually beneficial relationship. Now, this is where, of course, the next question arises, which is exactly what do you need to do to unlock and to strengthen this relationship? And this is where Global Gateway comes in. This is our offer to the rest of the world. And we here trying to base ourselves on four basic principles. First is that this must be, to be a real partnership, it must be a partnership of equals. It must be a partnership where we are working together to achieve these common objectives and to address these common challenges. And we are focusing in Global Gateway on a number of big transformations that are going to happen in the world anyway, with or without us. We talk about green transition, we talk about digital, we talk about the revolutions underway in healthcare, connectivity, the importance of education and research. This is all going to happen with or without us. So the question for us is, do we want to be part of that, or do we want to relegate ourselves to obscurity? And I think the answer to that is obvious. Second point is, yes, there is a lot of need. The world today, countries want to also invest in infrastructure. They need lots of infrastructure. But also that infrastructure, the hard investments, need to be accompanied by what I call the software. And I'll give a quick example. The work we're doing, for example, a topic that I'm directly involved in the issue of vaccine and medicines manufacturing globally. Yes, this is about encouraging European companies to invest in Africa and Latin America, etc. But it's also about the regulatory environment, so the support we give, for example, to the regulatory environment. It's also about creating new financial structures, the work we're doing with the Gates Foundation, with the EIB, on the Human Development Accelerator, the work we do on the demand side, so how to ensure demand, so work with Gavi on the AVMAP, so this was one example. We also want to make sure that the investments we make with countries will enable those countries to own those investments. So all too often in the world of development, there have been a lot of investments in white elephants, big, pharaonic projects that end up delivering nothing. Countries do not really own those investments. That is not the way we approach things. And also it's important to work in what we call a Team Europe mode, which is we have to recognize that there are enormous pressures on ODA. The report rightly mentions that aid is important for people. And I'm not surprised, because aid is important. But I think the question now for any administration I can think of anywhere in the world is not so much whether individual topics are important. Aid is important, health is important, education is important, environment is important. But how do you make the trade-offs if you have to choose between A or B or C, because you cannot do all of them at once? How do you choose? And we are in a world where we have to make increasing choices. So this is resulting in ODA, or at least the traditional ODA, declining, because there is less and less money in the hands of governments, especially in the traditional donor countries. So we have to think differently. How do we use public money to leverage much larger amounts of private capital in the hands of private investors, in the hands of financial institutions? How do we de-risk investments so that we can use public money as a leverage? We need to go from addition to multiplication. So this is the concept behind Global Gateway. Of course, it doesn't mean that we do all aid through Global Gateway. There are situations where you cannot do Global Gateway, situations where you have very difficult political situations where you cannot work with the de facto authorities for various reasons. And there we have to work with civil society, with other actors on the ground, and some other cases. But it's also a myth, and I'll conclude on this point for now. It's also a myth to believe that you can only do Global Gateway. This approach only works in relatively well-off middle-income countries. This is not true. We are doing these projects in LDCs, in fragile countries. I can mention examples, the work we're doing in DRC, in Somalia, in Pakistan, in Burundi. We have Global Gateway projects in all of these countries. So yes, we need to adapt to the situation. But I think this is looking forward. This will be increasingly the main thrust of our approach. Of course, without trying to, oversimplify and thinking that we can do everything just through one approach, but this will be the main approach.
Great, thank you very much for quite a comprehensive overview there. I'll let the audience digest that and turn now to Ambassador Campbell. Can you give us the perspective from Australia, please? Are you seeing a similar, more transactional approach shaping development cooperation? Is there a more security-focused narrative part of this? And what are you seeing as implications of these shifts? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And can I just thank ODI for the invitation to participate and also congratulate you and your team on the report. It sounds fascinating and very, very timely. Look, I'd immediately say the answer is complex because, a bit of background context for myself. Clearly, I have a security background. I'm married to a development assistance expert who ran Australia's programs in both Fiji, Tuvalu, and also in Papua New Guinea, and spent 35 years in this field. So kind of clearly at home, there's a sort of a complex there. Out in the world, from an Australian point of view, I would say we look out at 22 of our 26 neighbours are developing countries. And of the 22, about 3/4, let's say about 15, are fragile developing countries. So development of assistance in any concept and in any era has never been a question for Australia. It's part of the sense of desiring to be a peaceful, stable, prosperous country which can only exist in a peaceful, stable, prosperous region. And so Australia's declared ODA funding level, it has actually been gradually and in small increments increasing and is projected to continue to do so. We're at 2.8 billion euros, up 76 million from last year, tracking towards about 3 billion euros. And it's not a commitment that is seen as publicly contentious, contested, a point of great argument. But the question, of course, of what we do with our development assistance funding, it's not in the scheme of things across at least 22 countries plus others elsewhere. It's not a large amount of money. It has to be targeted very carefully. And if it's only that declared development assistance funding, you really wonder what difference can it make. And so Australia takes an approach of thinking from a very much a statecraft perspective. How do we engage the economic trade, the business opportunity? How do we engage in the development assistance opportunity? How do we engage in cultural, social, people-to-people connections and so forth? How do we do all of this with like-minded partners, often operating in complement rather than necessarily in an integrated program? But from the point of view that if I walked into the Pacific and say, in my former career, hi, I'm from the security sector, I'm here to secure you, or we're going to secure each other, whatever I might say. Well, the Pacific Island nations, a number of years ago in what's known as the Boy Declaration, made it very clear, declared as a Pacific Island community, their number one security concern is climate change. Okay, so that's why I say the answer is complex. These things that can be so intertwined, and behind that kind of reflection, you also see that at a geostrategic level in the Indo-Pacific, there is now what I think the overwhelming majority of commentators would say is an embedded strategic competition between the United States and China. Again, if someone were to come to my country and tell me about another country, I would wonder, you don't want to be friends with me, you don't want to work with me, you don't want to be in a development partnership with me. And I've seen different countries in different settings make that kind of mindset of I'm here to create the security from the competition. All that does is create a sense of whoever you're talking about, you're not talking about me and you're not talking about my problem, you're not listening to what are my concerns. So Australia very much focuses on relationships with our partner countries from a whole of societal statecraft perspective. How do we, for example, enable high quality banking services into the Pacific in settings where modern banking services would not necessarily be profitable, but the quality and the confidence in the financial management and oversight of those banking services is incredibly important in fragile states. How do we work with partners whose first concern is rising ocean levels and so forth? So it's been a very interesting journey, one that continues. I can't say, instead of, and I think as Martin was sort of intimating, some people can think that the word transaction is almost like a dirty word. I like to use the word our interest, national interest. Where does my interest as a nation and that of my partners overlap? And in that overlap, I think we can both guarantee we're in it for the long haul because we're both interested to be in it. And as I said, secure, yeah, fine, but really it's about peaceful, stable, prosperous. When you've got peaceful, stable, prosperous, you feel secure. You feel like you're in a region where the future is bright for your children. And so across things like banking, commercial investment opportunities, in civil society engagement, what we're trying to do is provide this full suite of opportunities and options, listening to our partners about what they are telling us they need, not what we think they need. And I think it's as you all know, it's a slow, steady effort, but it's absolutely worthwhile. And pleasingly, it's seen to be as such by the wide body of the public in Australia, and long may that continue.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. In your words of complexity and listening are very important in this move away from sometimes what's often the case of the supply-driven type of aid. And when we move to a partnership approach, that doesn't hold. So thank you very much for that. So now we'll move to, I am keeping an eye on time, but it is going very fast. And so, but that's not to in any way shorten your time for the first round, but let's get to the second round if that we can too. So Olumide, with the more explicit alignment of international cooperation with strategic interests, we know what they are. Where do you see the most significant opportunities to secure also the development angle and keeping the development impact there? And where would you rather call for maybe a cautious approach so that we can preserve development impact in all of this complexity? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ida, and thanks to ODI Europe and for the reports. I was one of those who talked to the team when it wasn't prepared, so I appreciate what came out of it. Thank you. So I'm going to pick, for my answer, I'm going to pick on the topic that Claire started with, migration. Because I feel that the perception from African countries is that the leading foreign policy objective of the EU when it comes to Africa is stopping migration, right? But if we're really looking for development impact, migration is where it is. We know, I'm pretty sure we all in this room know that ODI, remittances outstripped ODI about a decade ago, going to African countries. But let's put some number to it. Nigerians abroad sent home last year about $20 billion. That's probably more than the budget of DG INSPA, definitely double the budget of the German BMZ, right? It is for Nigeria the second largest source of foreign exchange for the country. Last year was about 5% of GDP. Right. So if we are really looking for development impact, we let people move. There is no way that African countries can provide the jobs for the young people on the continent. It's just not possible. It's never been done before in the history of humanity. Africans are not going to start it. When Europe faced the same kind of pressure in the 17th, 18th century, they moved to Oceania, they moved to the New World in the Americas. So if we really are interested in real development impact, we'll be looking at supporting migration in some way. Now, I understand the politics of this, but good thing I'm not a politician, I'm not a policymaker. I'm just telling you what makes sense from a purely economic and political economic perspective. And if we're going to look at the mutual interest part of it, it also makes sense for Europe. I saw a study by the Commission 2 or 3 years ago that says that by 2050, there's going to be 500,000 people in Europe, in the Union, who are over 100 years old. So you're having long life expectancy, you're having low birth rates, and you're seeing a small and shrinking workforce is going to be called upon to support an aging population, an increasing large aging population. It's not possible. Right now, in many countries, the single largest item in the budget is benefits. In Germany, about 25% of the budget is going towards subsidy for the pension system. Now, there are ideas on how to fix this at the margins, but it will delay things by maybe 2 years, right? Because you make people retire earlier, you increase contributions to the pension system. Yeah, it will fix things for you, but there is no real short-term domestic homegrown fix to this. It will have to include some kind of migration, people coming into work. We don't have the technology yet to actually allow us to not need people to do things. There are countries that have dark factories where everything is run by machines and robots and production and all of that. I don't think we have that in Europe at this point. And I also don't think we want old people to be cared for by robots at this point. So what I'm saying is, I understand how difficult this is politically. I understand what kind of guardrail of politics it is for policymakers and politicians in Europe to touch this. But if we are talking about the long-term competitiveness of European economies, if we are talking about Europe's ability to care for itself and maybe at some point, maybe in some way project strength, soft power, whatever you want to call it, to the world, we will need people to do that. And so I'm going to call on my colleagues in this community, the think tankers, to maybe look for ways to support policymakers to actually talk about this in a way that makes sense, in a way that isn't pandering to right-wing parties. What I normally tell center-right parties is this: there is nothing more conservative than ensuring our way of life in Europe. It's conserving that. That's what conservatism is. Thank you.
That's great, and call to the think tanks to help the policymakers on this hot potato. And it's certainly an issue that at the OECD we also track migration flows and show evidence about skilled migrants that come and they're a massive contribution to the economy. And so there are lots of positives to it, and I think that we need to bring the facts, like Claire said, into these narratives too. Joe, I'm going to turn to you now. And the question, it gets at the politics. So we're heading to politics and the world to Gail afterwards on the global issues. But how do we take aid out of its political silo? So there's a silo in which it's in this new context. And is it possible to make the argument more effectively that international cooperation enhances European security at this moment, when our security seems to be defined quite narrowly? So over to you, Jean. And I give the mic.
But first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's great to see people I know and so many people on a Wednesday morning. So it's great to see the interest in the room. First, I want to go on what Olivia just said about migration. Said I perfectly agree, and it's partly the response to the question. We need to change the mindset and say we need Africa know that Africa needs us, but we need it more. And you are perfectly right when you look at the figures of aging in Europe. Europe currently is only 5% of the world population, and it's shrinking, and our productivity doesn't increase. So we will need at one point a migration pact between Europe and Africa, and for that, international cooperation can play a role. How to de-silo politically? First, we need to tell our people and politicians that the world has changed. First, I just mentioned 5% of the world population, but not only that, we are not alone. And you perfectly mentioned, I think, Martin, that our partners have the choice. And the first ones who want a change of approach, it's the partners. I often hear people against the change in international cooperation telling, that the partners do not want the change. It's not true. They want. I travel a lot and I meet a lot of partners, and all of them tell us we need this change because we have the choice. We can choose between China, Korea, India, Japan, Qatar, and other countries that come with an offer as well. And for those traveling to Africa, you can see this increasing presence of other people. So Europe has not anymore, and the West in general, the monopoly of international cooperation. And it's if we don't realize that, I think we will only lose our influence in the world. Just to give you an anecdote, when I started at Enable, it was just before COVID, and then COVID happened. And by the way, those projects on medicines and how to manufacture vaccines were born during COVID. But right after COVID, we had this relaunch plan financed by the EU. And in Belgium, we had the minister in charge of this relaunch plan, new economic development. And at the time, I contacted his cabinet and said, we should make a link between Belgium relaunch plan, which sector we're going to invest in, and what we do in Africa. I never received an answer. Why? Because of the political silo you just mentioned. People were seeing what we do in Africa completely apart from our own policies. We need to do exactly the opposite. Because our partners, as I said, have the choice, so they will choose the partners that can offer them the best expertise. So we need to link our economic competitiveness and what we are good as a country, and not as a development agency or an NGO, but what as a collective group are we good at, so that we can better package it and offer it to our partners. So for Belgium, for example, pharmaceutical industry, we are very good at that. First vaccine product was produced here in Belgium. Logistics, port management, social security systems, all are Belgian strengths, and every country in the world have their own strength, and they can package it to sell it to the world. And by doing that, we will make the link between our own economic development and what we do abroad, and it will allow to de-silo. But it's difficult because most of the politicians see us as charity, as aid, as you mentioned, so we need to change this terminology. I think aid doesn't correspond anymore, and you work for OECD, but I always say that ODA, the three words are wrong. All official, you just mentioned remittance, it's very bigger in Nigeria, so what's official? Development, nobody wants it. Every country is in development, and aid, nobody wants it. So the terminology as well needs to reflect, to better reflect what we do. Second question, security. It's a good question because I have a lot of debate on that, especially with our Ministry of Defense, because indeed you see an increase of defense budget, 2%, 5%, and as you mentioned, sometimes the definition is very narrow because we invest on our immediate threats. In Belgium now it's anti-drones because we have those drones. So we need to reflect on that, and I think think tank has a big role to play because politicians tend to respond to immediate threats. Because public is afraid. Look at the drones here in Europe now, in Belgium. People are afraid, so we need to react, and we will probably invest in new materials. But we need to make people understand, and politicians in particular, what are the medium and long-term threats. The biggest threat we have as Europe is that we are shrinking. So we need to have a strategy that's also security issues. Critical raw material, it's a big thing for the EU, but we don't have any more European mining firms that are able to invest in difficult areas in Africa. But Australia has, and I look at the Australian ambassador here, so we should maybe partner with Australia or Canada to work together on mining and critical raw material to secure our own security threats because we don't possess anymore the control on the value chain. So yes, we can enlarge the definition of security, but it requires a lot of research, advocacy, and public awareness. And to finish, I want to say that because sometimes we confuse politicians and the greater public. Don't be mistaken, politicians only reflect what the public wants. So I tend to hear, yeah, there is a strong support for development aid among the public, but I don't agree. People will say, of course, if you ask somebody to say, are you for or against aid, people will say, I'm for. But when it's about paying for it, the support is not there anymore. Look at Belgium, 25% budget cuts of development cooperation budget. No reaction at all in the public, no debate, no people in the street. And I can guarantee you if Belgium cuts, because we're in budget negotiations, 25% more, there won't be any reaction of the public. So we should stop, I think, thinking that the public supports this. Doesn't really care anymore. Of course, they care about giving the money, but we should really be aware that there is also a need to increase awareness in the public.
Thank you very much, Sean. And I think we can maybe debate that as well. It'd be really great if those questions come up. Gail, you are launching also some new research today, I believe, with a new report that's come out looking at the EU's internal financing and aid programs, such as the EU structural cohesion funds. So can you tell us what you're learning and what are the takeaways for international aid in the future by sharing some of those findings? Thank you, Gail.
Yeah, thanks, Ida. Last but not least, and thank you again, ODI Europe, for the invitation to present our research here today as well, which I think is very complementary to what ODI Europe has been doing. Like ODI Europe, our report is very long, but have no fear, we've produced a 4-page, very digestible format. I have a copy here with QR code on, so you're very welcome to scan that with your phone before you leave if the topic is of interest. I co-wrote this paper with Jonathan Glennie, who's director of the Global Cooperation Institute. Our research paper is entitled 6 Lessons from the EU for the Future of Aid. Does Europe's experience offer insights for a more effective global financing system? But as Ida was saying in her introduction there, when I talk about lessons from the EU for the future of aid, I'm not talking about lessons from the EU's external aid programme for international aid. I'm talking about lessons from the EU's own internal aid programme, lessons from the EU's structural and investment funds, essentially its programme of various funds for its own member states, and how they're designed, how they operate, what they do, and what they can teach us for how we might rethink and reconceive a more inclusive and effective international aid system, which I think is what we're all interested in here today. And of course, we fully recognise that, like any aid programme, in inverted commas, the EU structural investment funds have their proponents and their critics. They're certainly not perfect in any stretch. But what we tried to do is look at how they're designed and pull out some lessons learned for international aid. Jonathan and I have been interested in this topic for years, and we still find it quite extraordinary that these two communities do not talk to each other at all. And yet there's so much little spoken about this topic, but there's so many analogies to draw. So we have 6 lessons in the paper, but don't fear, Ida, I'll share just 4 very quickly here today in the interest of time. So lesson 1, and I think we've spoken about this quite a lot on the panel so far. The first lesson is what we call strategic mutuality, and this resonates very strongly with the findings of ODI Europe. That narratives which emphasise common global challenges and concepts of mutual interest and mutual benefit are also highly relevant for international aid. I heard Angus, Ambassador, refer to peaceful, stable, prosperous societies and a region in Asia Pacific. These are the principles that underpin the EU structural and investment funds as well. And so we find that emphasizing these narratives around convergence and that joint investments in infrastructure, research and innovation, a cleaner, healthier environment, supporting all with emergencies, that even net contributors do actually benefit from doing this through better job opportunities, more resilient supply chains, better security, migration governance, all the things that we've been talking about. But of course, if we look at the international aid narrative, this contrasts sharply with that, because we still tend to think of aid as something that's given from rich to poor, as something that's charitable, and as something as a gift. But if we reframe it instead as something as a shared investment in global common challenges and collective prosperity, as we do with the EU's investment and structural funds, we find that that can perhaps build a more durable political platform for development finance over the longer term. A second lesson is about the continued value of supporting countries at relatively higher income levels. So under the current international aid system, we have this crazy situation whereby income level, your per capita income, determines eligibility for all forms of aid and concessional financing. This follows a somewhat flawed logic, but whereby when you reach a certain income threshold, you're suddenly determined that you no longer need any sort of international aid. And we know that that's simply not true. We only have to look at the climate vulnerable small island developing states for a case in point there, and yet we're seeing more and more of them graduate from eligibility for all forms of development aid, which is totally bonkers in my view, and being cut off from facing a cliff edge and being cut off from all financing just at a time when climate change impacts are accelerating. What we see in contrast with the EU structural and investment funds is that while some types of EU financial support do have an income threshold, an income eligibility criteria, many others do not. In essence, the purpose, volume, type of EU funds countries and regions receive evolves over time as their circumstances change. This implies that at no point do the EU funds become obsolete or irrelevant. So I think there's an important lesson there learned for how we perhaps tailor different forms of external aid support for countries in different circumstances. The next lesson is called grants, not loans. And I think this is really important. I mean, you were talking about this in the reference to the Global Gateway program there, about using private financing to catalyze use aid in more strategic ways to mobilize more private financing. And we see a big focus in the international aid system on private finance, blended finance instruments. They're increasingly being promoted when it comes to developing countries' industrialization and development goals. But we find that there's limited evidence that approach is actually working. And in contrast, within the EU's structural investment funds, grants remain the predominant financing instrument there. And that's a striking departure from what we're seeing in international aid. So I think there's an important lesson there. And we argue that grants remain really important, especially in a high income, even in high income contexts. Final lesson, it's about stakeholders, not beneficiaries. So this final lesson is about the governance of international aid. So of course, the governance structures of the EU funds are participatory, they're inclusive. This contrasts with the international aid system, whereby it's donors that decide what rules of the game are, like what counts and what doesn't count as development aid. So our key insight here is that international aid governance structures based more on shared ownership rather than donor control may improve accountability and effectiveness. So I think, listen, what we're saying here is that there's a lot to learn if we look at these different types of aid programs. And I just want to end with two specific asks. The first is that if you're really interested in this topic as well, we find there's a real dearth of research. Please do approach Jonathan, Glennie and myself if you would like to do more work in this area with us. We'd welcome more partnerships. And then the second is that there's actually an invitation to all of you to join an initiative called the Coalition on GPI, Global Public Investment, which was launched at the Seville conference at FFD4. So the Coalition on GPI is an intergovernmental forum whereby stakeholders can discuss in an inclusive manner the future direction of aid. So please do join that if you're interested as well. But would love to speak to more of you if you're interested in this work as well.
Thank you very much, Gail, and great lessons there. And yeah, a lot of food for thought in terms of how we rebuild international cooperation going forward. So thank you very much for that. Now, time has obviously got shorter. We had brilliant questions for a second round. I'm going to challenge the panel to have a 1 minute each on what I'm going to ask you. More on kind of how we turn now to operationalizing this idea of mutual benefit, how we take it forward. But 1 minute, and I'm going to kind of give you a wave when it's up. I'm going to be more disciplined. Because the room is packed here, and I'm sure you also want to hear from them and maybe open up other kinds of questions that we haven't touched on, which I think will be really, really rich and fruitful. So I'm going to stop now and turn to you in a meeting and ask you just to touch in really what you think is maybe the top 2 actions for operationalizing mutual benefit by the European Union.
Thank you. 1 minute. So one would be actually figure out what the EU wants development cooperation or aid to do, actually. Not what we think the public wanted to do, not what we think the recipient countries wanted to do, what the EU actually wants to do. That's one. Second is, if we're talking about mutual interest, then I would start by saying, what is the EU trying to achieve for itself? So what is the goal of the EU domestically for its own people? Where do relationships with other countries play a role here? We heard from Martin about Australia and minerals. Where does trade play a role here? And where does development cooperation play a role here? So, and if you're looking at development cooperation, and now here I'm assuming the moral argument, okay, so we don't have to stop. If we're looking at development cooperation, what can it actually do in this context? Can it build infrastructure? Is it at that scale? Is it policy work that it can do? Is it actually really be clear of what it can do and then communicate that with the countries that we're partnering with.
Brilliant, excellent. More granular.
That's more.
The questions will come back to you. So Ingus, to you. You're here now in Brussels. What opportunities do you see for the European Union in moving forward on this partnership model?
So my comment would be universal to all those who wish to partner with other nations, and that is ask them what it is that matters most to them, and then work out across your entire ecosystem of European activity or Australian activity or Japanese activity, what part of that ecosystem has a common interest in pursuing the partner's interest and create the connection.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So now, Jean, we're evolving this a little bit to the idea of shared global challenges, global public goods. How do you see that getting traction with European policymakers? He's timing himself.
Very short. First, I think, as I said, focus on what you do good. So be very clear. Two, use a language that people understand. So stop using development jargon, but speak as you would do here in Brussels or in Belgium, and stop using another vocabulary. And three, be very clear about the results and what is it for me, for the people here in Belgium, and what is it for the world? That's it.
Excellent. Gail, you're next. And your question was longer here, so I'm gonna go for the short ones, but you said you have a clear message that you want to convey in the second round, so go for it.
I do, and I'll be super fast. I think I'm going to pick up on this idea of listening, which I think Angus and both you other panelists have raised. The future of aid conversations are happening a lot in the global north, but we need to do a much better job of listening to what beneficiaries in the global south are saying, and make sure that they have we elevate their voices, and that they are also empowered and able to shape the future vision for aid as well. And then to come back to what you said in the intro, Ida, about it's what we do with aid and how we do it that matters. Absolutely, and I want to bring up the issue of localization here. This has been a long-standing request from many civil society organisations in the global south, that we need to do a far better job of channeling much more resources via local organisations that have a much better understanding often of what's needed. So I think those need to be part of the conversation on the future of aid as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Gail. And Martin, to you, with a little bit more complexity, if you don't mind. So how do you reconcile and match the listening for those partnerships with then securing the buy-in of the EU leadership and member states? So how do you go to frame that mutual interest in that way?
Yes, well, first of all, I think the dialogue needs to look then at how we use all the instruments we have. So not just the classic development type instruments, like the ones we manage in INTBA. For example, there's a big demand in many of our partner countries for cooperation in the research area, in the education area. We have a very powerful research program. We can use that. Second point is to be better at understanding what our strengths are as Europe. I hear too much doom and gloom, to be frank. And of course, we have to be feet on the ground, but there are also things we know how to do. The experience of the various waves of enlargement, for example. We have perhaps the most major example world today of massive, quick economic, political, social transformation. We need to package that. We have the knowledge of how to work regionally. Anyone can build a transport corridor, but how do you get, for example, the customs authorities of countries to cooperate, to work together, to make that transport corridor succeed? Anyone can build, I don't know, alternative energy plants, but how do you build a regional energy grid? We've done that. We've done joint procurement of medicines. We've done all that. We don't package it enough. This is why when we make our offer, we should also include, as the software component I mentioned previously, this experience. I think there's more work to be done there.
Great, thank you very much. And really, can you give me a round of applause? Because that was really good. Well, thank you very much. So now I think it's over to you all. We can take 10 minutes, right? Yeah. And so I'll take a few questions, and you'll be thinking maybe also what questions you might want to come back to. Of course, there may be some also specifically to you. But let's work this. But I think we want to crowd in because it's nice to hear what people are thinking about. I'm hoping that you have your questions ready. So who wants to go first? I think somebody has a mic in the room.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll do this side, and then that gives you time on my left side. So this gentleman in front of me here.
Good morning, good evening, for this director of the Wilfried Martin Center. One of the issues we have discussed for decades is this transitional problem. Claire, you alluded to the moment when you step into a next level of development. The same goes for humanitarian aid into structural aid. It remembers me a bit if you have a startup and you just fail. And most companies fail at that very moment because the instruments are either designed for the startup phase or the scaling up. So are there new instruments? Is this an issue we can better include?
Right, scaling up transition new instruments. Okay. And the lady just behind Peter. Okay, then introduce yourself, please, as well. Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Grace, from Circle Common Ground. I want to link to the point the ambassador made on needing peace, stability, and prosperity if people don't feel secure. So my question would be, where does conflict prevention and peace building sit in these transactional partnerships that you're aiming for? because we see a discrepancy between the focus on Ukraine and defense on the one hand and competitiveness on the other. And then basically conflict prevention of peace building was like the luxury that could be funded when there's still finance. But if you want human security, if you want stability, then obviously that's something that you need to invest in. And peace building is not perfect response. It requires long-term investment and not just signing a deal like some people across the Atlantic seems to think. So where does it fit?
Great, thank you very much. I have this lady here. The mic is coming that way, and then I'll move down. Oh, this lady here, so I won't move down, move over. This one.
Yes, Camilla Bruckner, heading the UN works towards the EU and also the UNDP office here in Brussels, where we are 33 UN agencies, many of my colleagues are here. Very warmly welcoming the ODI report and also all the panelists' interventions where I think there is large agreement in this room on all of it. And it's more a search of how to refine our approach, because I think what is essentially happening as well, while we, of course, the negative is that ODA is shrinking and the possibilities of leveraging that are getting more difficult. And it's also about involving larger stakeholders or more stakeholders of society in our collective investment in each other. So in that sense, the Global Gateway is very welcome. The risks, I think, are, and that's for all of us, is that we also throw out the baby with the bathwater and do not harness and replicate and further develop the things that have worked. And here I think Gail already highlighted some of the lessons learned, and I think Shell also underlined many of the experiences within EU could also be used as a model for how we engage with stakeholders. I think the most important, and this was raised by Ambassador Campbell, that the narrative we approach partners with, and here from the UN side, we have advocated that for a long time, that it's on equal partnerships footing, finding common interests, treating each other with mutual respect in the sense that we need you, you need us, etc. I think this narrative could be worked on by all of us, and I would appeal that this would be the next thing. And how do we then also change our collective behavior in how we finance the whole ecosystem of development aid, where it's maybe far too restrained for today's or rapidly changing world. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Camilla. I'll take a question over here, the lady beside you, Camilla.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Erica from Reimagine Europe. I'm very encouraged by this discussion and this debate. As an expert in narrative and really how the brain makes meaning, I wanted to ask how much you see as panelists this as an opportunity versus a loss, because narratives are actually framed by our brain's way of making sense of reality, and how we frame things is going to have a huge effect on its success. And I feel a lot of the narrative transitions, people tend to see it as a loss. We have to adapt because the world has changed. We need to, and I think the transactional world was mentioned before, has that residue. But I think what we have here is a huge opportunity, because the world is changing so quickly. It's not that our old narratives don't work because they were wrong from the beginning, but the world has shifted so much and is going to continue. So can we change this from a sense of a loss to a sense of opportunity? Because narratives in themselves are not right or wrong, they're more or less useful. You can do mathematics with Roman numerals or with Indo-Arabic numerals, both are correct, but one is much more useful. So I usually see this as, can we change from a Roman numeral to an Indo-Arabic? Because that will allow us to see the number 0. That will allow back in the day, the scientific revolution, the whole invention of science and the economics that we see now. And I think we're at that junction. So the question is, what is this? What is the framing that we can use to allow us to see the number 0? And congratulations for the goal.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question on this side. Camilo, I just had, well, 2 more, and then we'll close it off, and then I can refresh. I'm sure you're taking it, maybe refresh as well. Okay.
Thank you, and great panel, and this was a great report. My name is Camilo Garban. I work for sorry for the long name, International Forum on Foreign Official Support for Sustainable Development, also named as TOSI, Secretariat. So, yeah, we need to do something about it. So one of the first places in which you see this change of narrative is data. Is the way you collect the data, the way you visualize the data, the things that they consider relatable, not relatable, or the things should be, we should have this conversation. My question is, how do you envisage this change of paradigm, this change of narrative in the way we should collect and present data on development finance or talking about development support as a whole?
Great, thank you very much. And the last question is for yourself, Liz.
Thank you. Francesca Lamanchik from Wardrobe. Thank you for the panel. We've seen kind of governments across Europe turning to the private sector to help leverage their investments. I wonder where those sectors are kind of less favourable to the private sector, what do we do about that as a sector and ourselves to be able to pinpoint that aid and that leverage? And what challenges do you see with turning to the private sector in that sense as well? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm gonna maybe one more minute each, maybe 1 minute, 20 seconds. And Pastora is gonna come back. But we have one, two, so thank you very much first for your questions. And that's really great. I think maybe you've heard, but I'd like to start with Gail first, if you don't mind.
Get to choose from all of those rich contributions, which ones I answer. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to pick up on the point of communication, actually, because Claire, to go back to the very beginning, I think you mentioned international development as low salience and low knowledge issues, and that people are supportive. I would say there's been quite a few surveys where people have been asked about how much they think is spent on international development aid, and they tend to massively overestimate how much of their domestic budgets are spent on aid. And when they're told how little it actually is in practice, they're very surprised, and they say, oh, well, yeah, maybe it could be a bit more there. So I think we do need to educate people on how little it really is. And then I think, look, on this compelling narrative around shared prosperity and shared security, there's a lot of momentum around that. There's clearly some concerns around a shift in that direction. It's something that we're working on, that coalition on GPI, Global Public Investment, that I mentioned. So a plea to come join us and help craft that in a way that will work. The invitation is there again. Let us also bring into that conversation the narratives that we have around public versus private finance as well. I think for far too long we've had the narrative dominate that private finance is innovative and great and does all these wonderful things, when actually I would argue, and Mariana Mazzucato has done a wonderful job also of saying, actually it's public finance, not just domestically, but internationally, that is doing extraordinarily innovative and creative things. The EU doing so many good things as well in public financing, through blended finance, through many other instruments, guarantees, to do, and we don't shout up about just how important public financing is. So that has to be part of the conversation as well. And private sector will only go where there's profit. So of course there's going to be loads of countries and situations left out. So don't get me even started on that.
Thanks, Gail. We'll come back this way for the meeting.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to pick on the narrative point. So it feels to me that the conversation here in Europe is finally catching up to what Africans have been asking for a very long time, which is treat us with respect. Let us know what you want. Let us know how this is working for you so that we can understand what's in it for both of us. Finally, we're getting there. So I want to agree with you that we shouldn't consider it as a sort of loss of something, because for other parts of the world, it's a finally, we're getting to where we actually understand maybe what you want out of this. And I would say that it's very clear what African governments want out of any relationship they have with partners. They want to industrialize, because that's the only way that humanity has ever delivered prosperity at scale, period. They want to do that. Now, the question is, who can support them to do that? Can Europe support them to do that. Qatar, Gulf countries, China, whoever, they are agnostic about where the support comes from. So the question is, and like Angus mentioned earlier, when you look at the constellation of countries or actors around the world that you can work with, what do the objectives that European countries and the Commission, the objectives they've identified for themselves, how do those connect with the objectives of other countries, including developing countries, and where can aid support those objectives? So I agree with you, we shouldn't consider this a loss, otherwise we're going to be in a permanent state of loss because things keep changing.
Thank you very much, English.
The point about conflict prevention and peace building, that is one that's been taken on very seriously by Australia in recent years at a sort of global geostrategic level, where in a world where NATO says that it is returning to its core functions of deterrence and defence. You know, you see that I mentioned the embedding strategic competition in China and the United States. So at that global level, but also at the level of a world in which 2024 saw the largest number of conflicts on the planet since the Second World War, we need to be in conflict prevention and peace building, because war is tragic, it's awful, and it drains the potential, the prosperity, the opportunity. And there's so much that can be done if you can prevent it. So it's a considerable line of Australian foreign policy effort now, and I think similarly we will see through European efforts as well. Narrative, we are in, I would say, a global narrative contest enabled by that ubiquitous, instantaneous and multifaceted modern social media digital environment. And it's not one narrative vice another, it's a multitude of narratives. We have to be engaged, we have to know what we want to say, and we have to be able to say it in ways that are impactful to our audience.
Thank you very much. Martin.
Thank you. I'll take the question on the role of the private sector, which I think is fundamental. I mean, the reason why we need the private sector is not only to leverage more funding, that's part of it, but also to tap into the vast reservoir of expertise, knowledge, know-how that the private sector has. I mean, we in the public sector, I'd like to think we can do a lot of things, and probably we can, but we don't have the expertise to produce green hydrogen or vaccines or medicines or whatever. That expertise lies with the private sector. So I like to think about international partnerships from our perspective also as a public-private partnership, where we can combine the know-how that we have in the public sector with the knowledge in the private sector. Now, the argument is often made, and I've heard it again today, the private sector is of course motivated by profit, so it will cherry pick. And to a certain extent, that creates a healthy competition. Countries want to create profitable ecosystems to diversify their economy. But it's also about talking to the right part of the private sector. So in the one of the sectors I'm responsible for, the health sector, the big demand from our partner countries was we would like to have more local manufacturing of vaccines, medicines, etc. Of course, if you talk to the big pharma companies, they have very little motivation to look at the needs of Africa or Latin America because they're doing very well in the existing markets. But if you talk to the innovative sector of the pharma industry, what drives the value of their companies is showing that they have innovative technologies that can solve the insolvable problems. No? So when they see unmet or poorly met health needs in Africa, they see that as an opportunity to show what their technologies can do. So there you can create a win-win situation. So it's talking to the right people that matters. And we can do that systematically in each and every sector. So it's important to tap into the right part of the private sector.
That's great. Thank you very much, Martin. John.
Thank you. I will take the question on the loss of opportunity. I think it's an opportunity, and I will be very positive. I think if we manage to convince the general public and our politicians that it's a good investment for ourselves and for the planet, I think there will be more money. And to come back on the question of Camilla, for me, we discussed that already, I'm against the idea that we we can do more with less or less with less. We need more money. And come back to the private sector question. I'm convinced that to attract more private sector investment, like in any country, you also need public investment. So private sector will not come if there is no de-risking mechanism. So we should all advocate for more public money on ODA or a new name that you find, because it will attract additional investment and there will be leverage. So I'm very positive for those who follow me on LinkedIn. I try to give a positive message, but we need to reinvent ourselves in a positive way, in a way that speaks to the general public. And if we do that, we will be successful. And we do that for the good cause of our common planet and common public goods.
Well, thank you very much, Jean. A round of applause again, please, to the panel. I think we've stopped on a positive note, so I'm going to hand over to Dora to take us forward on the next steps. And while she's setting up, just to announce that in May next year, the OECD will host a conference on the future of international development cooperation as a stepping stone also to the narrative and maybe a reframing and renaming. And so please watch that space too, and come and join us and contact me if you're interested in being engaged. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A huge thank you, everyone. A huge thank you to our wonderful panel. That was absolutely fantastic, and for the wonderful moderation. Please do stay in touch. We will be sending through the full report on email, so you've got it, and very much look forward to continuing to work with you as we go into the MFF negotiations and everything else that's going on in the coming months. Thank you once again, and have a lovely day.
I'm very